In January 1904, thousands of miles away from Europe, in the southern African colony of German Southwest Africa, a nation of people known as the Herero took up arms against German authority. What transpired over the course of the war led some historians to claim it was the first genocide of the 20th century. At first glance, this argument seems plausible, if not obvious. The Germans nearly wiped out an entire tribe of people, with some estimates topping 100,000 dead. Women and children were not excluded from the atrocities, and concentration camps were constructed throughout the colony. The military commander even issued a now infamous extermination proclamation ordering his troops to shoot at women and children. Faced with such facts, how could anyone think such a loss of life was anything other than a planned and systematic policy of genocide? Were actions taken that contributed to mass killings? Yes. Were atrocities committed? Absolutely. However, an unfortunate chain of events put the war in motion that, when combined with the German military culture, led to the final outcome. Debating genocide on numbers alone disrespects those who perished. Blame for the tragedy must be placed on the inherent characteristics of imperialism, combined with the German military machine being allowed to act without political and civil counterbalances. Southwest Africa was the largest German colony both in size and population. It was considered to have the most potential for German settlement due to its climate and landscape. The land was more suitable for farming and ranching than Germany's other African colonies, which were covered by thick jungles and mountains. The two major native tribes in the colony were the Herero in the north and central regions, and the Nama in the south. German policy towards the natives had been to maintain a formal peace with the tribes, yet preserve a level of tension between them. This policy was successful at preserving German authority with minimal expense. In 1904, Theodor Leutwein served as both the colony's governor and the commander of the Schutztruppe, the colonial defense forces in the colony. Leutwein was an effective administrator who emphasized trade and peacekeeping agreements with the Herero and Nama. He had anticipated conflict with the natives and wanted to gradually diminish the natives' political and social systems so as to minimize conflict. This way, if war became inevitable, the colony would be profitable enough that it would be able to finance the fighting without causing an economic strain on Germany. Unfortunately for Leutwein, the settler and trader-based economy arrived too quickly and resulted in war before the colony was prepared. The colonial aim of Germany in Southwest Africa was to have a successful colony that would provide economic benefits as well as opportunities for German settlement. The colony's economy was based around ranching, farming, mining, and the railroad. Due to its size, it was economically vital that Germany initiated extensive railway building in the colony. This rapid construction was not seen in the other colonies and was one factor that accelerated the process of disposing the Herero of their land. In order to facilitate economic development, Germany would eventually need to destroy the political and social systems of the native populations. As more white German settlers arrived in Southwest Africa, the economic strain on the Herero intensified. The Herero were a semi-nomadic people who relied on cattle herding. The settlers who conducted ranching and herding used African cattle, thus draining the supply from the Herero. Competition soon erupted between the settlers and the Herero over the best grazing lands. The settlers eventually took the land with the help of German authorities. These actions were compounded in 1897 by an epidemic that struck down half the cattle population in Herero herds. This loss of land and cattle economically ruined the Herero. Concurrently, the demand for labor and cattle by white settlers was on the rise. Employment on white farms and ranches, as well as the ever-expanding railroad, became economically appealing to displaced Hereros. In 1897, a new settlement policy was enacted that resulted in the removal of Herero by treaty and by force to land reservations, thus making it easier for white settlers to take Herero lands. This policy was similar to that of the United States with the American Indians and produced similar reactions. Many Herero were pulled from their traditional way of life, and the tribe was threatened with social and economic extinction. Faced with this dire future, the Herero people chose to rebel.
All our obedience and patience with the Germans is of little avail, for each day they shoot someone dead for no reason at all. Hence I appeal to you, my brother, not to hold aloof from the uprising, but to make your voice heard so that all Africa may take up arms against the Germans. Let us die fighting, rather than die as a result of maltreatment, imprisonment, or some other form of calamity.
The Herero Rebellion began January 1904. The rebellion was led by the main Herero chief, Samuel Maherero. The uprising was a complete shock to Leutwein, who was in the southern part of the colony with about 75% of the Schutztruppe forces putting down a minor revolt. Revolts in the colonies were not uncommon. A pattern almost emerged whereby the natives would revolt, the Germans would put them down, and then negotiations were held where the initial grievances would be aired. In this case, however, Leutwein severely underestimated what was happening in the north and initially felt he could easily suppress the revolt with the forces he had available in the colony. During the initial Herero offensives, approximately 100 settlers, farmers, and soldiers were killed. Farms and ranches were burned to the ground, and the railroad from Windhoek to Swakopmund was destroyed in several places. Telegraph communications were also damaged and disrupted. The Herero, however, failed to take advantage of their initial successes. The only German resistance that remained was in the fortified garrisons and towns. German Marines from a nearby battleship and an early detachment of 800 reinforcements were the first to arrive in southwest Africa. However, these troops were ill-suited to colonial warfare. They were inexperienced, in unfamiliar territory, and most importantly, they were unmounted. Unmounted troops were at a disadvantage due to difficulties with the terrain and climate. Until Leutwein could return from the south, the Germans were restricted to maintaining communications, protecting the settlers, and repairing the railroad when possible. When he finally did return in mid-February, he found the situation was clearly worse than he had first thought. Leutwein was well suited to his dual role as military leader of the Schutztruppe and governor of the colony. He had formed relationships with the natives that would benefit him both in his civilian and military capacity, and felt that all diplomatic solutions should be pursued before resulting to total warfare with the Herero. As news of the rebellion spread, there were rumblings both in the colony and in Germany calling for the removal of the Herero tribe from southwest Africa as the only way to ensure long-term peace there. In response, Leutwein wrote the following in a report to Berlin.
The rebels must know that a line of retreat is open to them, which does not in every case lead to death. Otherwise, the war will end in a fashion which will be to our disadvantage. For example, the Spanish continuously won victories in Cuba, but they did not succeed in bringing the war to an end and consequently lost the island. I agree with the authorities in Berlin. Conditions of surrender should be nothing but unconditional surrender. I do not agree with those strident voices raised in favor of total annihilation of the Hereros. Aside from the fact that a people numbering 60 to 70,000 cannot be so easily annihilated, I would have to argue that such a measure would be an economic error. The people must only suffer a political death.
One of Leutwein's first actions upon his return was to immediately write to Samuel Maherero. The Colonial Department halted Leutwein, ordering him that there were to be no negotiations without permission of the Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Leutwein bitterly protested this restriction on his authority. While Berlin saw Leutwein's letter to Herero as an attempt to negotiate, Leutwein himself had used this tactic before for reconnaissance. He wanted to know the reasons behind the revolt. Leutwein soon realized that the Herero were fully committed to this war. They had gathered together their entire tribes, women, children, and cattle, in their homelands and did not flee to British territories in the east or into Ovambo land in the north. Leutwein decided to wait until reinforcements could arrive. Leutwein would not have that option available to him, though. The Kaiser had appointed the General Staff in Berlin to oversee the efforts in southwest Africa. The General Staff proceeded to conduct the war from Berlin, over 5,000 miles away, in a style more suited to European conflicts rather than African colonial warfare. They also effectively turned a native rebellion into a full-scale war. Leutwein's decision to wait for reinforcements was rejected by Berlin, and he was ordered to move against the Herero as soon as possible. Historians have divided the rebellion or war into four main phases. Berlin's directive that Leutwein act resulted in several battles and skirmishes with the Herero, which made up the first phase of the war. It wasn't until 6 weeks into the war that the Germans finally won their first field engagement. 2 companies of Schutztruppe and 1 company of Marines faced about 1,000 Herero warriors. After 12 hours of fierce fighting, the Herero slipped away and casualties were listed at 12 Germans dead and an estimated 50 Herero. 2 weeks later, a German patrol consisting of 11 officers and 46 soldiers were involved in a full-scale battle with the Herero, resulting in approximately 75% of the officers killed and nearly half of the soldiers. The surviving Germans were forced to retreat under cover of darkness. Nearly a month later, a German patrol of 237 soldiers was attacked by the Herero, resulting in a battle that lasted 5 hours. In the end, 32 Germans lay dead and 17 were wounded. The Herero casualties were numbered at 75, with many more wounded. In the aftermath of the battle, the Germans found the bodies of captured or wounded soldiers who had been clubbed to death and horribly mutilated. Naturally, the Germans were horrified at this discovery, and it contributed to the belief that wounded German soldiers had been tortured. It also reinforced the already rampant notion that the Herero were savages and hardly entitled to protection under international law. In April, Leutwein and the Schutztruppe were able to push the Herero out of the towns and managed to reclaim the railroad that would play an important strategic role in supplying the forces. A pivotal battle was fought at Ongunjira, where Leutwein, 800 soldiers, and 160 natives advanced on a Herero force numbering 5,000 to 6,000 warriors, of which about half were armed with rifles. The battle raged from early morning to late afternoon. At several times, the situation became critical for the Germans, with only their superiority in weapons forcing the Herero to retreat. The retreating Herero were followed by the Germans to waterholes at Ovambo. As the Germans set up camp, the Herero surprised them. The Schutztruppe engaged nearly 3,000 Herero soldiers at Ovambo. Surrounded, the Germans formed the rectangle, and the battle continued for more than 10 hours. For the Germans, the situation had reached a dire stage. The infantry had used up approximately 75% of the ammunition, and the artillery was almost out. Faced with a lack of ammunition and supplies, and encircled by the enemy, Leutwein decided on a strategic nighttime withdrawal in order to save his forces. This marked the end of the first phase of the war. Leutwein decided there would be no more operations until reinforcements could arrive. The withdrawal by Leutwein horrified the General Staff in Berlin, where it was perceived as an embarrassing military defeat. Public opinion in Germany was that the war had turned into a national crisis, the likes of which had not been seen since the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. Berlin and the High Command had openly scorned the British for their difficulties in South Africa just a few years earlier, and now they were faced with a similar situation in their own colony. To the Germans, it was incomprehensible that half-naked black men using guerrilla warfare tactics could reap as much death and devastation as a well-trained European soldier. The General Staff had seen enough and petitioned the Kaiser to replace Leutwein in his military capacity. On June 11, 1904, Lieutenant General Lothar von Trotha arrived in southwest Africa and met with Leutwein to discuss the war. At this meeting, Leutwein stressed to Trotha that the Herero should be dealt with in such a manner as to allow them to continue as a nation of people.
If one did not offer the hand of reconciliation to the rebels after they had had sufficient punishment, one faced the danger of unending conflict.
Von Trotha responded to Leutwein's suggestion of how to deal with the Herero by stating,
I know the tribes of Africa. They are all alike. They only respond to force. It was and is my policy to use force with terrorism and even brutality. I shall annihilate the revolting tribes with streams of blood and streams of gold. Only after complete uprooting will something emerge.
These contrasting statements clearly illustrate how far apart Leutwein and Trotha really were and how they wanted to run the war. Meanwhile, Trotha demanded and received complete authority over the conduct of the war. He was apprehensively viewed by the Colonial Department as a man capable of thinking only in purely military terms. Trotha was experienced in colonial warfare, having been the military commander in East Africa, conducting small but brutal campaigns there. He also led a German contingent to China to quell the Boxer Rebellion. He had been encouraged by the Kaiser to be ruthless in China, which he was, setting an example for future colonial warfare. As the British had learned a few years prior in South Africa, wars fought in faraway colonies place a great demand on manpower and supplies. Trotha used the months of June and July to prepare for the war that was now entering its second phase. The Herero had been terribly underestimated and proved, in fact, to be a formidable adversary. However, just as Leutwein had initially underestimated the Herero, Samuel Maherero, too, had misread the German situation. He interpreted the battle at Oviumbo, which he had unknowingly nearly won, as a failure. Maherero and his people withdrew to the north near the WATERBERG, a large plateau north of Windhoek that provided a good supply of natural springs. It is situated on the western edge of the Omahiki Desert and away from the railroad. Here, the Herero congregated in the tens of thousands, and here is where they would have their final stand. Not only did Maherero envision a final stand, but so too did Leutwein and Trotha. Trotha saw the WATERBERG as a perfect location to force a final and decisive battle to end the war. Up to this point in the war, nearly all previous battles had been fought near the railroad, which was of importance to the Germans in regards to supplying the war effort. The WATERBERG, however, was not located near the railroad. The Germans were forced to utilize ox wagons, which made the already long supply lines more difficult to sustain. Here, the Herero waited while the Germans continued to bring in supplies and troops. On August 11, 1904, the Battle of WATERBERG commenced. Trotha and 96 officers commanded a force consisting of 1,488 soldiers, 12 machine guns, and 36 pieces of artillery against Samuel Maherero and an estimated 40 to 100,000 Hereros, of which 4 to 6,000 were armed warriors. Trotha employed the principle of encirclement. He hoped to crush the Herero and take the majority of the Herero army prisoner. The Herero were gathered to the south of the WATERBERG and east of Little WATERBERG. Trotha and the main force would attack from the south, while Major von Ersdorf would press forward from the northeast. Captain von Fielding was positioned to the northwest to block any Herero retreat between the WATERBERG and the Little WATERBERG Mountains. Oberlieutenant Volkmann would do the same from the north. Major von der Heide, who had the smallest detachment, would attack from the southeast, and Colonel Deimling, who had the largest deployment, advanced from the west. The main detachment advanced toward the waterholes at Hamakari near the south of the Herero positions. The Germans, however, were taken by surprise when the Herero instead attacked them first. The fighting was fierce, and one company was forced to retreat. At one point, the field guns were nearly overwhelmed, and Trotha himself was directly involved in the fighting. Despite the pitched battle, Trotha and his main force were able to hold the waterholes, and the Herero withdrew. Meanwhile, Colonel Deimling, who had been ordered to advance to the waterholes and meet up with Trotha's main force, had not been heard from all day. He had instead marched all the way to WATERBERG Station at the foot of the WATERBERG Plateau, causing the Herero to flee to the east with barely a fight. Von Erstorff's forces engaged the Herero in heavy fighting, eventually defeating them. Von der Heide's force had actually come under attack by a large contingent of Herero fleeing from the fighting at Hamakari and WATERBERG Station. Von der Heide needed to wait for darkness before he could finally push through and meet up at the Hamakari waterholes. In the meantime, Samuel Maherero had decided the battle was one he could not win, and he continued to flee to the east. At this point he knew the Germans did not want to negotiate, and he planned to flee to British territories in the east. Only one thing stood in his way: the Omahiki Desert. The next day, on the 12th, Deimling finally arrived at Hamakari with his large force. This was the final push that sent the retreating Herero fleeing to the southeast, away from the WATERBERG. Trotha allowed his troops to recover and regroup for the pursuit the next day. The entire area around the WATERBERG, where the Herero had been prior to the battle, had been completely grazed out by their cattle. German horses and supply animals were unable to feed here. To complicate the pursuit, every waterhole the Germans reached had been left fetid and choked with dead Herero cattle. Each ensuing battle proceeded to break the Herero into smaller and smaller groups and sent them further into the desert. Supply became increasingly difficult for the German patrols, and Trotha became frustrated at his inability to force a decisive military defeat on the Herero. He ordered the western and southwestern edges of the desert to be sealed off and prevent the Herero from returning to their homelands. On October 2nd, 1904, faced with the military setbacks after the Battle of WATERBERG, Trotha issued his now infamous Extermination Proclamation. He assembled Herero prisoners, hung the males, and then sent the women back into the desert with translations of his proclamation, which read,
I, the great general of the German soldiers, send this letter to the Herero people. Herero are no longer German subjects. They have murdered, stolen, cut off the ears and noses and other body parts from wounded soldiers, and now, out of cowardice, refuse to fight. I say to the people, anyone delivering a captain to one of my stations as a prisoner will receive 1,000 marks. Whoever brings in Samuel Maherero will receive 5,000 marks. The Herero people must leave this land. If they do not, I will force them to do so by using the great gun. Within the German border, every male Herero, armed or unarmed, with or without cattle, will be shot to death. I will no longer receive women or children, but will drive them back to their people or have them shot at. These are my words to the Herero people.
These further instructions were then read to the German troops at roll call, clarifying the exact meaning of his proclamation.
This proclamation is to be read to the troops at roll call, with the addition that the unit that catches a captain will also receive the appropriate reward, and that shooting at women and children is to be understood as shooting above their heads, so as to force them to run. I assume absolutely that this proclamation will result in taking no more male prisoners, but will not degenerate into atrocities against women and children. The latter will run away if one shoots at them a couple of times. The troops will remain conscious of the good reputation of the German soldier.
With the Herero effectively sealed off in the Omahiki Desert and militarily broken, it is estimated that between 40,000 and 80,000 of them perished. In Germany, Trotha's proclamation was met with mostly shocked reactions. Leutwein, the colonial department, and the imperial chancellor, along with missionaries and some of the German population, attacked Trotha's actions, especially the proclamation. They petitioned the Kaiser to order Trotha to rescind his proclamation. They argued that the loss of the Herero as a cattle breeding and labor force would be an economic disaster in the colony. Furthermore, the Herero who managed to escape would become a welcome and cheap labor force for the British. They claimed that Trotha's plan was impractical and impossible to effect. Lastly, they argued the proclamation was a denial of all Christian and humane principles and that it would be detrimental to Germany's place among civilized nations. In December, Kaiser Wilhelm II ordered Trotha to repeal his proclamation and instead grant clemency to any Herero who voluntarily gave themselves up, so long as they were not directly involved in the killings or leaders of the revolt. Furthermore, missionaries would be allowed to negotiate with the Herero wishing to surrender. Trotha was furious and responded to the colonial office that they appoint a civil governor to handle negotiations, as he had no intentions of being personally involved himself. Meanwhile, Samuel Herero had fled with about 1,250 others through the Omahiki Desert to British territory. A small contingent managed to slip north into Ovamboland. The majority, however, endeavored to slip back to the west towards their traditional homelands. They either died in the desert or were killed or captured by German troops, where they were sent to concentration or prison camps beginning the third phase of the war. As Trotha was now compelled to accept prisoners, there began a period of internment of the Herero who gave themselves up. The Herero were collected by missionaries and then shipped to the prison camps, which were run by the military. In addition to the prison camps, many were sent as forced labor to companies such as the railroads or private farms and ranches. Conditions in the camps and for those forced to work were horrible, and it is estimated that nearly 45% died in custody. By February 1905, Trotha declared that operations against the Herero had ended and only cleansing actions continued. The fourth phase, or Nama Revolt, actually began back in October 1904, shortly after Trotha issued his proclamation. When the Nama revolted, the Germans were as surprised as they had been when the Herero did. They should not have been. There were threats and rumors that after the Herero uprising had been suppressed, the Nama would receive the same treatment. Calls were made to disarm the Nama during the fighting against the Herero. Faced with the disarmament and dismantling of his tribe, Henrik Witbooi led the Nama against the Germans in the south of the colony. Witbooi would be killed in battle soon after in late October, but the Nama continued their guerrilla war that lasted until March 31st, 1907. The war against the Nama differed from the war against the Herero in many ways. The lack of a railroad restricted reinforcements and supply to such a level that the tactics used against the Herero at WATERBERG would be impossible. Moreover, the Nama fought a guerrilla-style war and did not offer the opportunity to fight a full-scale or decisive battle as was sought against the Herero. The genocide and near total destruction that descended upon the Herero never manifested itself against the Nama. German troops felt less threatened by the Nama since they were a much smaller group than the Herero and were located in the underpopulated south of the colony. The Nama's guerrilla warfare tactics posed limited opportunities for even isolated atrocities. As in any conflict, atrocities are inevitable. Some would argue warfare itself is an atrocity against humanity. Looking at the Herero War void of emotions, one must see how the unfortunate events that led to the deaths of so many natives were in fact the result of many different factors and not of an intentional genocidal agenda of the German authorities. Isabel Hull's book, Absolute Destruction, paints the clearest picture of how the situation in Southwest Africa spiraled out of control. East German historian Horst Dreschler makes the claim that even someone ignorant of military matters could see Trotha's plan was to deliberately force the Herero east with Daimling's larger force and cause a breakout past Van der Heide. However, this theory is totally contrary to the actions of a man whose view of the war was a purely military one, as von Trotha's had been purported to be. In military terms, the Germans would have been better off had they been able to crush the Herero at the WATERBERG and end the war with the decisive victory that they had sought all along. As it turned out, the pursuit of the Herero into the desert took a far greater toll on the Germans in both military and ultimately political terms. German military doctrine called for bringing to bear superior technology in a decisive battle. Should that battle fail to produce the desired decisive victory, then the doctrine called for pursuit. The Germans did not anticipate a pursuit would be necessary, and it was not until 2 days later that Trotha finally ordered it. This was illustrated best in a letter by one of Trotha's captains, Heinrich von Welk, who wrote the following to his father.
Headquarters was not prepared for the eventuality that a people of 60,000 and perhaps as many cattle could escape wholesale after so many months of careful preparation. The first order came 5 days after the breakthrough. Until then, complete planlessness reigned and an unbelievable lack of supplies.
This quote shows that Trotha and the Germans had not devised an evil, convoluted plan that called for the Herero to break out of the encirclement precisely where Trotha wanted them to, into the Omahiki Desert, where they would perish of hunger and thirst, as Dreschler would have us believe. In fact, it was the complete opposite. It was rather poor planning combined with mistakes and ignored orders that allowed the breakout. Trotha had actually ordered a huge detention facility be built to accommodate up to 8,000 Herero prisoners. He also ordered 1,000 chains. Leutwein had invited the missionaries to discuss prisoner logistics, and private companies had already begun to take bids for prisoner workers. These facts lead to the conclusion that a breakout was the last thing the Germans wanted. It is true that the breakout occurred where the German forces were weakest. However, there is a reason for this. An old soldier's maxim states that one should always count on the enemy doing the most intelligent thing, always assume he will do what is most unpleasant for us. The most unpleasant outcome the Germans could envision would be a breakout to the west, back into the colony, and a return to the towns and farms they had just cleared. Therefore, Trotha's largest contingent was in the west. To make up for the smaller forces in the east, Trotha compensated them with extra officers and extra artillery. As it turned out, Daimling's disobeying Trotha's orders forced the Herero to the east and overran Heide's smaller force. Trotha was initially livid with Daimling for disobeying and wanted to have him court-martialed. This never was, and the General Staff's official history of the war attempted to deny that Trotha had ever intended to encircle the Herero at WATERBERG. But the fact remains, the battle was supposed to be a textbook concentric battle ending in total victory. The Germans felt anything but a total victory at WATERBERG would be viewed by the Herero as weakness and therefore encouraged continued aggression and endangering security. By failing to produce this final victory, Trotha was compelled to continue in pursuit and try to force another decisive battle. In Trotha's mind, there were only two possible outcomes for the Herero: total German military victory or permanent disappearance across the border. Trotha even recorded this in his diary when he wrote,
I will stick with my idea to pursue and fight them whenever I can, or to drive them into English territory and then leave a strong border occupation there.
As the Herero were pushed east into the desert, non-combatants fled the fighting in search of food and water at the waterholes now occupied by the Germans. Trotha, already faced with a lack of supplies for his own troops and not willing to stop military actions to tend to the Herero, reissued his order that women and children be driven away. That Trotha had to reissue the order also hints that at least some of the German troops were unwilling to act harshly towards these Herero. Some, maybe, but not all. After WATERBERG, the violence was increased as the Germans pursued the Herero in final victory. In a report to the General Staff, a lieutenant colonel stated,
The general had forbidden killing women and children, but all armed men who were captured had seen their last hour.
Trotha did up the violence, and Isabel Hull argues in her book that the goal of total destruction of the enemy created an atmosphere where massacre was approved, even expected. However, the massacre at WATERBERG cannot be equated with extermination. Administrative massacre is one of the way stations to that goal, but is not identical with it, and in most situations does not lead to it. The new German reinforcements were especially influenced by this atmosphere due to their being inexperienced, poorly led, tired, frustrated, and hungry for battle. Just as the troops were frustrated, so was Trotha at his inability to end the war at WATERBERG. The Extermination Proclamation is perhaps the main argument historians use to claim a premeditated intentional genocide. What many overlook is the actuality that the proclamation came out after these actions were already occurring. The proclamation did not cause the atrocities, it merely sanctioned what was already happening and therefore does not give credence to the argument that the massacres were intentional. Based on the timing of its release, frustration seems to be the main motive for its being issued. One can also read from the fact that the proclamation was issued to the Herero and a further order issued to the German troops, clarifying that Trotha intended for his troops to shoot over the heads of women and children, not at them. That another motive is psychological warfare, meant to drive them away and prevent the Herero from filtering back into the colony. Some have also claimed that Trotha attempted to save face at home by appearing fierce in domestic propaganda. Whatever his intentions were by issuing the proclamation after the Battle of WATERBERG, about the only thing Trotha ensured was that negotiations were now practically impossible, and it kept the war out of civilian hands. After the Herero resistance was broken at WATERBERG, Leutwein and his supporters would have called for negotiations since the German troops had been unable to end the war militarily. This was no longer possible. While the war was kept in the domain of the military, practices developed on the run as events unfolded. The General Staff did not directly run the war, but instead set expectations that were impossible to meet. Far from a deliberate policy of genocide, the war followed the following general course: concentric battle at WATERBERG, pursuit, punitive internment, court-martials with frequent executions of prisoners, on-the-spot executions, targeting of all fleeing Herero, and finally, massacre. Furthermore, Trotha's preparation and execution of the war was unrealistic. The Germans suffered heavily from poor logistics due to the lack of a sufficient transportation system. When the war shifted towards the WATERBERG and then further east, the use of ox cart became necessary as the railroad was too far away. As conditions worsened for the Germans, so did the conditions offered to the Herero and prisoners, to the point it dropped below subsistence level. Failure to achieve the elusive total military victory resulted in an increase of violence and public calls for the deportation, expulsion, or death of the Herero. Only after the massacres had occurred did Trotha match those practices with policy by introducing his proclamation. The deterioration of events that resulted in the disastrous finale developed under the unique circumstances present in Southwest Africa and was not an ordered or deliberate decline. In fact, the effects on the Germans were disastrous in terms of their military campaign and the long-term viability of the colony. It destroyed the colony's workforce, decimated the cattle populations, prolonged the war, and raised the Germans' casualties and expenses for the war. German military culture is based in rationality, and the events in Southwest Africa were irrational from the perspective of the desired goals. The military's ability to act free from the political and civil oversight was met with dire repercussions. Other colonial powers were faced with similar events and actions in their colonial wars, such as the French in Sudan and Indochina, and the British in South Africa during the Boer War. Military actions have a tendency towards extremes, and it is the civil government, public press, political parties, and private groups who counteract these extremes. In the case of the British during the Boer War, these counterbalances saved the denigration into annihilation. These outside influences in Southwest Africa were removed and allowed the military culture free rein, resulting in the regrettable outcome in which all sides ultimately lost.